communicates with him in a historical dialogue. Bullet. Therefore, no formula of faith can exhaust the truth. It can be exchanged for another formula more meaningful to the contemporary mind. Bullet. Every formulation of a divine mystery is only the beginning, never the terminus. Bullet. A theory of the development of dogma which emphasizes the social, historical, and non-conceptual forces impinging on this process. On the basis of these principles, Catholic doctrines have been reformulated. Allow me to take an overview of this process. One of the first to reformulate Catholic doctrine was a famous book entitled A New Catechism and then subtitled Catholic Faith for Adults. It was originally published in 1966, but later revised in 1970 under the general responsibility of the Dutch hierarchy. It became an international bestseller. This so-called Dutch Catechism contained a section on family planning. It noted that there was a clear development in the late 1960s, both within and outside the Church, toward the use of several methods in regulating births. The Dutch Catechism said, and I quote, "There is now a growing sense of the independent human value of sexuality. Sexuality and fertility are seen more clearly as values which are combined in the one totality of life rather than as factors simply arranged in the relationship of means to an end. Are all methods of regulation of births of equal value to the Christian conscience? The Council gave no answer to this question. It does, however, call on married people to ask themselves conscientiously whether the practices in question do or fail to do full justice to the great personal values which should be expressed in sexual intercourse and in the whole of modern life." I am quoting from the Dutch Catechism. I now come to this famous line: "The last word lies with the conscience, not with the doctor or with the confessor. But reverence for life undoubtedly demands that no practices be chosen which could be harmful to health for the effective life." Nearly 2 decades later, in 1986, an Oxford University chaplain took note of the then raging debate on family planning after Vatican Council II. He wrote, 1986 yun ang napakainit na pagdebate tungkol sa reproductive health. Tayo naman sa Pilipinas, 2011 na, napakainit pa rin ang debate natin. This Oxford University chaplain wrote, and I quote, "The resolution of this dilemma between the care for the family and responsible parenthood on the one hand and sustaining love on the other hand seems to be found in contraception. But as everyone knows, the teaching of the Catholic Church forbids the use of artificial contraceptives. There seems to be an impasse at this point. It may be, therefore, that a positive attitude marked by purity of heart could help most to resolve the impasse, marked by purity of heart." By 1994, a widely hailed masterpiece, the book entitled Catholicism, stated, quote, "The birth control question, once a sharply divisive issue in the Catholic Church, is no longer a matter of intense discussion among the theologians, but it retains its importance as a paradigm of the 20th century debates concerning the nature of Catholic morality and the limits of Catholic teaching authority. What is really the issue, therefore, is not birth control in this generic sense, but contraception, that is, the intentional placing of a material obstacle to the conception of a child, for example, a contraceptive pill, an intrauterine device, contraceptive foam, a condom. One side argues that contraception by such artificial means is always wrong. That, by the way, remains the official teaching of the Church today. The other side argues that contraception may be not only legitimate under certain circumstances, but even mandatory. This side speaks in terms of responsible parenthood. Liberation theology. Liberation theology is a theory originating among Latin American theologians, which interprets liberation from social, political, and economic oppression as an anticipation of eschatological salvation. Liberation theology is a species of progressive theology which is based on the following principles. Bullet. The Church, not just the hierarchy, is a mystery or a sacrament. Bullet, the church, not just the hierarchy, is the whole people of God. Bullet, the whole people of God participate in the mission of Christ and not just in the mission of the hierarchy. Finally, bullet, the mission of the church includes service to those in need and not just the preaching of the gospel or the celebration of the sacraments. Liberation theology is a part of post-Vatican II ecclesiology, which emphasizes the nature of the church as an earthly community of human beings who have a mission in and for the world that includes the struggle on behalf of justice, peace, and human rights. The appearance of liberation theology has been called one of the most significant developments of the last several decades. It is called a new way of doing theology. Classical theology aimed at a deeper understanding of faith. Liberation theology aims to transform the world, following the famous dictum of Karl Marx that the task of philosophy is not to understand the world, but to change the world. Classical theology seemed removed from day-to-day experience. Liberation theology has grown out of the experience of certain Catholics with the harsh reality of the miserable poor, what we now like to call the poorest of the poor. Classical theology interpreted Jesus' messages of the kingdom as a guide to personal morality. Liberation theology sees Jesus' message as above all a call to struggle against the social forces of oppression. Liberation theology believes that the kingdom of God is partially realized when social justice and love are advanced in society. When we take a step toward social justice and love, we take one further step toward the final consummation of the kingdom of God. I humbly submit that the struggle for an RH bill to protect the health and quality of life of the mother and child in the context of unspeakable theology is part of liberation theology. It emphasizes that the church's existence is not for itself, but for others. Accordingly to liberation theology, the church must listen to the world and be evangelized by it. According to the principal theologian of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, the church should be a place of liberation where there is a break from an unjust social order. I respectfully submit that in the Philippines, the church must take a clear stand against social injustice. In all humility, I dare to echo the call of liberation theology. The first step in abolishing injustice is to recognize how much the church itself is tied to the unjust system that oppresses the very poor. RH is available to the rich. Reproductive health is available to the rich. Why should it not be made available to the very poor? Catholic support for RH is a call to the major themes of liberation theology in a developing country like the Philippines, namely, bullet, the injustices visited on the Filipino people by neo-colonialism and imperialism. Bullet, reinterpretation of salvation to include every form of servitude. And bullet, the kingdom was beginning in this world, in this country, in the Philippines, in this time, now. In the light of the Filipino experience of the poor, we should take a profoundly historical approach to God. The self-revelation of God and the Filipinos' human response is an ongoing historical process. The God revealed in Jesus Christ is not a, quote, unmoved mover, unquote, but a God whose very essence consists of love. The RH Bill is an enterprise in social justice and in love for the poor. In 1986, the Vatican made a positive critique of liberation theology by issuing the document entitled Instruction on Christian Freedom and Liberation. According to the instruction, the supreme principle of the Church's social doctrine is Jesus' great commandment of love. Christian love, when applied, may take various forms in accord with the changing circumstances of history. We now understand that as compassionate disciples of the Lord, the Church exercises a special option for the poor and shows them a loving preference. The compassion and love of the Church must extend toward the poor of whatever kind, to the infant in danger of being aborted, and particularly to the poverty-stricken Filipino mother denied the basic information about her own reproductive health. the primacy of individual conscience. In 1965, Pope Paul VI issued an encyclical letter entitled Dignitatis Humanae, also known as Declaration of Religious Freedom. In section 3, paragraph 4, he wrote, and I quote, "Man perceives and acknowledges the imperatives of divine law through the mediation of conscience. In all his activity, a man is bound to follow his conscience in order that he may come to God, the end and purpose of life. It follows that he is not to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his conscience." Allow me to repeat. It follows, said the Pope, this Pope who issued Humanae Vitae in a prior encyclical. This Pope said, it follows that a man should not be forced to act in a manner contrary to his conscience, nor, on the other hand, is he to be restrained from acting in accordance with his conscience, especially in religious matters. In 1967, the same Pope Paul VI issued another encyclical entitled Populorum Progressio, also known as On the Development of Peoples. In section 37, he wrote, quote, "It is for the parents to decide with full knowledge of the matter on the number of their children, taking into account their responsibilities toward God, themselves, the children they have already brought into the world, and the community to which they belong. In all this, they must follow the demands of their own conscience." Please allow me to repeat. The Pope is speaking. In all this, they must follow the demands of their own conscience, enlightened by God's law, authentically interpreted and sustained by confidence in him. In 1993, Pope John Paul II, another pope, issued his encyclical entitled Veritatis Splendor, also known as the Splendor of Truth. In section 64, he wrote, quote, "The authority of the Church, when she pronounces on moral questions, in no way undermines the freedom of conscience of Christians." Allow me to repeat. This Pope, the authority of the Church, when she pronounces on moral questions, in no way undermines the freedom of conscience of Christians. This so, the Pope proceeded to say, this so not only because freedom of conscience is never freedom from the truth, but always and only freedom in the truth, but also because the magisterium does not bring to the Christian conscience truths which are extraneous to it. Rather, it brings to light the truths which it ought already to possess, developing them from the starting point of the primordial act of faith. And here is the famous sentence: "The Church puts herself always and only at the service of conscience." Pardon me if I repeat. The Church puts herself always and only at the service of conscience, helping it to avoid being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine proposed by human deceit, and helping it not to swerve from the truth about the good of man, but rather, essentially in some difficult questions, to attain the truth with certainty and to abide in it. Against these encyclicals on freedom of conscience, the 1968 encyclical Humanae Vitae by Pope Paul VI, based on a minority report of the Papal Commission, strikes a discordant note. It declared as erroneous the principle of totality, under which contraception should be considered morally legitimate in the context of the totality of a fruitful married life. Instead, the encyclical declares, and I quote, "The Church, calling human beings back to the observance of the norm of the natural law, as interpreted by constant doctrine, teaches that each and every marriage act must remain open to the transmission of life." This has become one of the most controversial statements in the history of the Catholic Church. Humanae Vitae by itself has drawn a great divide between Catholics. It has stirred up a storm, thus, and I quote, "The negative reaction of many theologians, moralists, and non-moralists alike was vigorous and widespread. Bishops' conferences around the world accepted the encyclical as authoritative teaching. However, some of these conferences drew attention, for example, to the primacy of conscience, the need to be understanding and forgiving, and the